Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution's effect on transportation and communication. So in history, when there was an Industrial Revolution, there were normally two other revolutions that accompanied it. And this still stands true today. Whenever there was an Industrial Revolution, or in today's case, a technological revolution, there is a communication and transportation revolution as well. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, long-distance communication was a system that was through a mail and carriage service, which could take 1 or 2 months to reach certain cities in the United States. Americans who wanted faster communication were excited when they found out about Samuel Morse's invention. In 1832, Morse perfected the use of the telegraph. The telegraph was a device that could send information over wires using an electric current. The telegraph machine was connected to electric wires, and when the machine connected two metal points, it would create a current that was heard as a clicking noise. An associate of Morse created a code which became to be known as Morse code, which used clicks and would create letters in the alphabet. The time in which the metal points touched each other made a difference in the length of the click sound. A longer press meant a longer click. These currents eventually became known as dots and dashes, and it was those dots and dashes that were arranged in patterns to represent the letters of the alphabet. As the railroad spread throughout the United States, so did the telegraph. It really caught on in 1844 when the Democratic National Convention sent the name of their candidate through the telegraph to Washington, D.C. The electric telegraph was followed by the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 and adopted quickly for short-range oral communication of cities in the United States. So whenever there was that Industrial Revolution, I said there were two that follow close behind: communication and transportation. Both revolutions encompass inventions that made life easier, quicker, or more efficiently. The transportation revolution covers all three. The 1800s gave rise to the first transportation revolution that was an effect of the Industrial Revolution. The transportation revolution was a period of rapid growth in the means of transportation. Two new forms of transportation flourished in the 1800s, and that was the steamboat, which was invented by Robert Fulton, and the steam-powered train. In the beginning, steam engines were used for textiles and grain mills, but soon became the primary source for transportation vessels, and in 1769 and onward, the steam engine underwent almost continuous improvements for more than a century. On steamboats and trains, people and goods and information were able to travel rapidly and efficiently across the United States in record times. No longer were Americans relying on horse and carriage over rough terrain to transport products to sell. The transportation revolution created a boom in businesses across the nation by reducing shipping costs and time to get products out there. In 1807, an inventor named Robert Fulton invented the steamboat, testing his flagship, the Clermont, on the Hudson River in New York. Fulton was going to prove that his steamship would be faster than conventional sailing. He left New York City to sail to Albany, New York. The trip looked to be a complete failure when the steamship stalled minutes into its maiden voyage, but Fulton and his crew found a solution to the problem, avoiding this disaster. His steamboat made the 150-mile trip in just 32 hours, a trip that took conventional sailing ships 4 days to complete. The steamboat was a success. Steamboats were pivotal for interstate trade, allowing goods to be moved more quickly and cheaply, so much so by 1840 there were more than 500 steamboats in use. In 1824, the United States Supreme Court heard the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, which argued the power of the federal government and its authority to control interstate trade. Gibbons traveled from New Jersey waters into New York waters and was told that it was against the law to travel in these waters without multiple licenses. Gibbons argued that a federal license meant that he could use the New York waterways without another license. The Supreme Court agreed with Gibbons, stating that the federal government has more control over interstate commerce than states. The result of the case was that the Supreme Court reinforced the federal government's authority to regulate the trade between the states, or otherwise known as interstate commerce. The barges were big and could move lots of people and goods. However, they were also very dangerous. Steamboats used large boilers filled with water that burning wood or coal would heat, boiling that water and creating steam to power the engines. 21% of steamboat accidents between 1811 and 1851 were caused by boiler explosions. It was very rare for a steamboat to last more than 5 years, and between 1830 and 1839, 272 steamboats were destroyed after less than a year or 3 years of travel use. This leads us to another form of transportation. Just like many of the aspects of the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution started in Great Britain. The use of steam-powered trains had been developed in Great Britain, and it took 30 years for the idea to catch on in the United States. Businessman and inventor Peter Cooper convinced the owners of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O Railroad, to allow him to test his new steam-powered locomotive named Tom Thumb. In 1830, he got his wishes and was able to test his invention under one condition. He raced a horse and carriage. The locomotive started off very strong, traveling around 15 miles an hour, which was far outpacing the horse, when a belt fell off in the engine and the engine lost power, allowing the horse and carriage to catch up and pass the locomotive. Despite the breakdown, the rail company was impressed and the locomotive took off. The railroad then expanded quickly around the nation. By 1860, there were about 30,000 miles of tracks that linked American cities around the nation, with most of these lines being located north and in the northeast. There were roughly 22,000 miles of track in the north compared to only about 8,000 miles in the south. This would have serious consequences during the Civil War. Until then, the nation's economy surged as railroads moved goods cheaply to distant markets. One of the most celebrated acts in a nation's history was in 1869. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The East and the West Railways met in Promontory, Utah, and a solid gold spike called the Golden Spike was driven into the ground, celebrating the meeting of the East and the West Railroad. As railroads became faster and grew larger, cities were connected across the nation. People in all areas of the nation would now have access to products that were made and grown far across the country. Cities and towns were emerging from the East Coast to the West, giving Americans more areas to live. Cities like New York and Chicago became transportation hubs. The nation's borders were expanding, and precious treasures like national parks drew large crowds of people out west. National pride and patriotism flooded the American psyche. Now, in the beginning, trains were primarily run on wood-burning steam engines. The railroad industry fueled the lumber industry and led to large-scale deforestation in the United States. So another source of fuel was needed to sustain the steam engines. As trains grew bigger, coal replaced wood as the main source of fuel, and the coal industry flourished. Coal was shipped cheaply on trains and became the main fuel in homes and the emerging steel industry, thus leading to an expanding and successful coal industry as well. So you could see, as the Industrial Revolution flourished, a communication revolution and a transportation revolution flourished as well. And all three of these revolutions helped aid and build an emerging economy in the United States. I'll see you next time.